Hey everybody, my name is Noah Wagner. My pronouns are he, him. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on reimagining policing and public safety. I am here with three fantastic human beings, experts in their field all, and we're here just to continue this conversation around policing, around public safety, what it is, who is best suited to do these services for us, with us, and really, are we getting the most out of what we need from folks? Are there better folks who can do these services better? So with us today we have Vinnie Cervantes, Carmen Rivera, and Ebony Morgan. So I'm gonna just pass it over to, we'll start right with Vinnie. And if you can just share a little bit about who you are, why you're joining us, a little bit about the organization you're with. Yeah, we'd love to hear about that, and then we'll just dive right in.
Yeah, thank you. My name again is Vinnie Cervantes with Dasher Denver Alliance for Street Health Response. Go by pronouns he, him. And Dasher focuses on bringing community-based responses to conflict and crisis to Denver and surrounding areas in Colorado. We're most known for our association with the Denver STAR program, Support Team Assisted Response, which is similar and inspired by the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon. But we've also since started working with about 12 to 13 different communities in Colorado to bring similar models to those cities as well. We also focus on more of a full spectrum approach to public safety, which includes basic human needs and restorative justice, transformative justice. Prior to being part of Dasher, I was also part of criminal justice reform efforts since about 2014. And really, it was the limitations on reform that brought me to create Dasher and to start working towards alternatives to policing and jail.
Awesome. We'll pass it over to Carmen next, and then follow it up with Ebony.
Thank you, Noah. My name is Carmen Rivera. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an adjunct instructor at Seattle University for the Criminal Justice Department. I earned my master's and my bachelor's in criminal justice forensic psychology, and I believe in the power of education and teach very passionately about not only criminal justice reform, but abolition as well. It is because of the movement around reimagining public safety that I actually have also decided to run for Renton City Council position 2, because we need immediate change like right now in terms of how we view public safety, how we fund it, how we fund our communities, and really handle what's happening to our communities and to our most marginalized populations. And so I spend a lot of my time, I've worked in or adjacent to the criminal justice field my entire career since I got done at the age of like 23, and I've worked in corrections, I have worked in the community, and as an educator, I work with a wide variety of criminal justice professionals. And also on a personal note, I'm the daughter of Seattle Police Department's first Puerto Rican born hired police officer, who was hired during the height of affirmative action hiring in the 1970s. And so I have kind of a unique perspective in how I view criminal justice, specifically the institution of policing and the history of policing, what that plays, how that plays into the movement today.
Hey, I'm Ebony Morgan. I am the program coordinator for the CAHOOTS program in Eugene and Springfield, Oregon, who's been providing mobile crisis response in that area for more than 30 years. And I am also a crisis worker on the van and a registered nurse. I'm really passionate about public health and public safety, and really creating a community where people feel cared for and safe in their spaces and in public. And to me, it's not a radical idea. So I get really excited to be involved in conversations like this, because personally, I lost my father to police violence when I was 5. And that's not something that I can ever get back. So I put a lot of energy into trying to figure out what a world looks like where support arrives and offers you the help that it really is you're asking for. And I think it's a really simple thought at its root, and I am really excited to be able to talk about it today.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite parts about chatting with the three of you and kind of developing what this might be is just how not radical this idea of public safety, public health, being served by people who are trained in those fields. And it's not radical. And I, as someone who is not in this field, I'm a diversity and diversity, equity, and inclusion educator. So I have some context around this, but as someone who is fairly new to the idea of reimagining policing and really questioning what public safety is, it just, getting down to the fundamentals of what is public safety? What is that? What does that look like? And I've always been someone who was like, well, we call the police. They're there to help us. And I've been very fortunate to have friends who have used kid gloves to start, and they've taken those off with me and really pushed me to think about who are the police serving? Are they the most effective in the ways that we're using them? And so really just challenging what that means, and getting into just, again, that root of what is public safety. And so I kind of want to, that really is the fundamental question of what is this? What have we been using the police for in the past? And is that, what we want to continue using them for? And so I kind of want to, again, go down Vinnie, Ebony, Carmen, and kind of get your thoughts around what is public safety? What is it? How does it change across time? Has it always been the same from its beginnings? Is it the same in the United States as it is in the UK or in other countries? So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what public safety is, what it looks like, has it changed, and what do you think is effective about it, I guess?
Well, yeah, I mentioned earlier that Dasher kind of focuses on the spectrum of transforming safety, which includes 4 different buckets that we define. One of them being community empowerment, which includes community building, education, and employment. The other bucket being basic human needs, which includes housing security, food security, access to health care. Another bucket being crisis response, which includes mental health de-escalation and mental health first aid de-escalation and medical response. And then the 4th bucket being kind of healing and after a crisis occurs, which includes transformative justice, restorative practices, and counseling or other types of mental health treatment. We consider these things to be not linear, but cyclical. And so we're always focusing on these issues in terms of when a crisis occurs or preventing crisis. But I think, safety has transformed as our cities have transformed, as our communities have transformed, but some of the basic tenets exist with regards to basic human needs. And one of the examples in Denver is that we spend $588 million on public safety. That's 1/3 of our $1.5 billion municipal budget. And one of the largest focuses on our public safety budget, which includes mostly policing and jail, really entails navigating our issues with homelessness, which includes criminalization, harassment, displacement, and other types of enforcement of basic human needs, or quality of life crimes. And so knowing that, we also spend about less than 1% of our municipal budget on affordable housing. So for Denver, safety largely looks like how we navigate homelessness, how we navigate displacement in our city, as we're one of the most highly gentrifying cities in the country. But also, we're not actually working towards ending that problem. We're addressing those issues by virtue of making them worse through criminalization. And that's what Denver looks like. But as we're working with different cities across our state, we understand issues of mental health that are being escalated by the pandemic, issues of increased displacement and unhoused people being unhoused through the pandemic and eviction crisis, and further issues with substance use. Colorado just got done with its deadliest year with substance use last year in 2020. And so, but I think a lot of the issues around safety for us are really defined in our budget through the way that we use the criminal justice system to address public health issues. And I think that there still needs to be a lot of reckoning about how we have criminalized and kind of commodified public health issues to be something that falls under public safety. But for Denver, it does entail those things of homelessness and other types of violence that we experience, none of which I would say are being addressed by our current approach in the criminal justice system.
I appreciate all of those points. And really, as a nurse, I'm approaching public safety through public health. And that's just what makes sense to me. And I'm thinking about what we know to be the foundations of health and wellness, because a healthy and well community is going to have a lot less strife and difficulty, right? So how are we supporting our community members in being truly well? And when you see continuing increases in homelessness, like in our area, and substance use and mental health crises, and these concerns aren't addressed proactively, but rather police are tasked with responding to those, or even CAHOOTS is tasked with responding to those reactively, that we're still not getting to the root of it. And to me, true public safety and public health looks like starting at the beginning. And that would be something that looks like, to me, the next phase of public safety, right? Is how do we put just as much energy into preventing the crisis as we do to responding to it, and responding to it with the appropriate resource. I think we've seen public safety take a significant trajectory, and what that gives me hope for from now forward is that it can look different than it's been looking from now past, right? And the history of policing is layered, and I have a feeling that Carmen might be able to speak to it better than me. But I also, it didn't start anywhere that was truly for all people, right? It started rooted in this idea that some people deserve to be owned. And as long as that's true, we're going to run into barriers. And one of the things I like to highlight is if you're going to try to implement an alternative response system, that system needs to be so deliberately anti-racist that the current systems of oppression that exist are not going to be able to infiltrate it. Because if you have a system that embodies the same built-in structures of oppression, people aren't going to trust it. And without trust, mobile crisis is not ever going to thrive the way it needs to. You have to retain that trust in your community. So to me, public health and safety is truly people feeling safe. And like when they have a crisis, they can really call for help. They truly know they can call somebody and they're going to show up and they're going to help them get their needs met. And that isn't something that we do as cheaply as possible. It isn't something that we do as quickly as possible. It's something that we do as well as possible. We commit our resources to it and our time and our energy, and we figure out what the future of public safety really looks like and how many different pillars of public safety we're going to need to have to make that happen.
I really love this conversation, and I feel like we're talking about public health and public safety, which historically has been two separate things in our society, especially in American culture. And so I love that both of the other panelists are talking about what public safety should be and how public safety should be approached through a public health lens. Unfortunately, that's not the reality we're living in. We view public safety very much the same as policing. Policing and public safety are one and the same in American culture and American law enforcement, unfortunately, when we should, as the other panelists have talked about, view it and look at it and attack it and approach it through a public health lens with a public health approach. However, as Ebony just talked about in terms of history, the birth of our country is plagued with genocide and racism and slavery. And we saw the development of the first municipal urban law enforcement institutions, police departments, as we know them today, when slavery was still part of America's culture, economy, and the birth of capitalism, essentially, when we really want to look into it. And so even after the Civil War, when we saw the end of slavery, mind you, we still had, before that, we had law enforcement officers who were also called slave patrols. Their jobs were to actually go and find runaway slaves and return them to their owners. That is a root of law enforcement. That is the history of law enforcement. At the end of the Civil War, which was in 1865, we saw the end of slavery, but then we saw the beginning of Jim Crow. So law enforcement police officers, as we know them today, after the Civil War, went back to their jobs, by the way, as bankers. You know, those soldiers in the Civil War for the Confederate side, they went back to their jobs as bankers, as police officers, as the people who made the decisions and the laws that developed the Jim Crow era to make it impossible for Black people and brown people to be successful in this country. And law enforcement enforced those laws. They enforced racist laws that made it difficult for people to even own property, to move, to work, I mean, to do anything equitably or even equally to their white counterparts. We didn't see the end of Jim Crow until 1965. Yeah, 1965. Let's all for a minute do the math. That is 56 years ago? Like, that's a lifetime. My parents were alive for that. And so up until then, most of our law enforcement officers were white, cisgendered men who were very privileged and benefit from the system that they were enforcing. And so then we see the end of Jim Crow. So now law enforcement doesn't have to enforce those really racist laws, right? And so what they do is they now go around and they start the war on drugs. And so if you look at your timeline, we see the end of Jim Crow, but we see the beginning of war on drugs, where again, police officers were the ones responding and putting Black and brown bodies in our criminal justice system because of this war on drugs. And now we've seen the most grotesque increase of incarcerated people in the entire world. We have the most incarcerated people in the entire world. And so public safety, the idea of what it should be is through a public health approach, through looking at homelessness, by attacking racism, by offering substance abuse services and resources and supports, right? But that's not what we do. We were born and raised to understand that no matter what, you call 911, and the police become a catch-all for everything. And not only just police, warrior-style policing. Warrior-style policing was the type of policing that was most utilized until maybe 10 years ago, maybe? And so you're expecting to tell me that in maybe the 50 years that we have started on police reform, that's going to undo the last 200 years of racist, discriminatory marginalization that policing has been backing and enforcing since the birth of our country. And so that is the reality of public safety. That is a very ugly truth of what public safety is in this country. And it's not what it should be, because what public safety should be is helping people. It's not helping people as much as it's hurting and negatively impacting people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, this and that's like that right there is why we're talking about this, why this is such an urgent conversation, is that, particularly white folks, particularly cisgender, straight folks, we think of the police, the way that I started understanding it when I was younger is, well, when I'm a kid, I need somebody to help me. And so those are my parents. And then when you become an adult, who is going to be that parent figure? Well, we've decided that the police are going to be there. They're going to help you if you're lost. They're going to help you if your house is on fire. They're going to help you if you can't find your dog. They're going to help you if somebody's making you uncomfortable. They're going to help you if there is a Black jogger near you. And then we start getting like very, very weird reasons that we are using the police. And none of this makes sense. And so, with CAHOOTS and with Dasher, mm-hmm. I'd love for you to be able to talk a little bit about, I know Ebony chatted about in a previous call about how, Dasher, CAHOOTS, these community style services are not taking the job away from police. They're supporting them. I'd love for you, Ebony in particular, and then Vinnie, if you would, if you could talk a little bit more about that. You've mentioned the 3 pillars of support, and what are the 2, and then what does the 3rd one look like as public safety and as as support?
When I talk about the 3 pillars of public safety, I'm talking about police and fire and paramedics, and then mobile crisis. Crisis responders to me are as significant of a pillar as any other, because a crisis can turn out to be many different things. And we have learned to have these 2 existing entities be the catch-all. And whatever's going on, that is who you call, and one of those 2 people is going to show up. And one of them can take you to the hospital with lights and sirens, and one of them can take you to jail with lights and sirens. And then they have been added on this other scope of responsibilities, because those are not the only times that people call for help. People don't only call for help when a crime has been committed or when they are having a heart attack. Sometimes they call for help because they're seeing something that they know isn't there, and they're terrified of that and they don't know what to do. Or they know that their loved one has been struggling really hard with their mental health and maybe has been expressing some suicidal ideation, and they want to make sure that that person doesn't follow through on this plan to harm themselves because they have a whole life they're supposed to live. Sometimes people call for help because they need somebody to show up, but what they don't need is for it to be viewed as a crime or a medical emergency. They need someone who is trained and intentionally shows up to see what are all the factors here and what is it that is going to help you the most. And in doing that, in doing those pieces and showing up for behavioral health calls, crisis workers aren't taking the jobs of the police, and we are also not solving the system of policing. We aren't resolving any of the systemic oppression that exists there, and I would never claim that we were. But what we're doing is inserting something different, and we are inserting public health into the lane of public safety, because that is where it should be. And so when we're showing up on a call, trauma-informed and providing client-centered care and consent-based services, our number one priority is to establish trust with the client and maintain that trust with that client as much as we possibly can, because at any minute they can tell us they don't want to engage with us anymore. So we are held in every minute to a standard of conduct that earns their participation with us. And that is how, to me, responding to someone in crisis should be. If you're not helping, then perhaps you're not the answer for that moment. But if you can find a way to help, then do so, because we're all humans. And within CAHOOTS, we know that we are humans helping humans, right? Like, that's what we're here to do, is say, this moment seems ridiculously hard for you. I don't even know yet how we can be helpful. Can we work that out together? Because we are just here to help you figure out what your next helpful thing is going to be. I'm not here to tell you who to be. I'm not here to give you advice. I am here to help you figure. So I always, again, circle back to the fact that we're still not proactive, we are reactive. And one day, if we could talk about like abolishing CAHOOTS because we need to start the crisis response sooner, I would be really excited about that. But in the meantime, I think it really makes sense that we are sending the appropriate resource to the need in the moment. And the more that we can figure out how to do that, truly the better, because we're going to get people that are skilled and trained for their specific pockets. If someone has an automatic rifle and is threatening a whole group of people, I mean, if I happened to be there, I could try to have a de-escalation conversation with them, but that's not who you're going to send, right? Like, someone's not going to call me and be like, can you send me Ebony to try to calm this person down? I don't think that's it. So by no means would I say that CAHOOTS or mobile crisis in general has solved public safety and the issues that it runs into. But I will say that it is something different, and it is something that gives me a whole lot of hope.
Yeah, I really appreciate that framing of like, it's offering another option to folks that don't have one right now, that have this very limited option of policing, like you said, the ambulance, or, you know, and so that's really what we approached STAR with, is that we know that, and we continue to work on the fact that STAR was not everything that we wanted it to be in Denver when we first launched. And we knew that, and we knew that there were still some really problematic connections to that system of policing when it was launched. But it was giving people another option. And that's really important for us to be able to kind of give people that kind of like, just that taste of something different and something that they can use that isn't an armed officer showing up saying, well, I can't do anything unless there's a crime having been committed. But in many cases, you know, they find a way to get involved in ways that are probably more harmful in a lot of situations, especially when it comes to homelessness and mental health crisis. You know, we were inspired by a lot of situations, but in particular, Michael Marshall, who was murdered in 2015 here in Denver, who was experiencing a mental health crisis because he lost his Bible. And if we had had an option back then of somebody showing up to say, to first of all, address that person's immediate needs and comfort them and not arrest them for trespassing, where he was eventually brought to the jail and killed, then he would still be alive today. Or at least that's our argument. And my very strong belief is that he and many others would still be alive today. And I don't find it ironic that the single biggest call that the STAR program has responded to is trespassing as related to homelessness in Denver. And so we already know that it's having some level of impact that we wanted already, but there's also some problems with that. And, Ebony mentioned the 30-year history of CAHOOTS, where when we visited Eugene in 2019, that's something that we heard from the residents out there that we spoke with, of like, they know what CAHOOTS is, they trust it, they know that like when they call it, they know the people that are going to show up, they know like that they're not going to hurt people more than help them. And unfortunately, STAR is getting off to a start where there are already some problematic affiliations with some of the people that are on that van and the organizations that are providing that immediate response. And so for Denver, like, we are still working on making this a fourth pillar that the community can trust, because right now there's a lot of barriers to that. And that's why in Aurora, we decided to launch the program outside of the police department on inception, rather than in the police department, like how Denver STAR program was launched. And I would also say that, like, as we advocate for programs like these across the country, in Denver and other cities in Colorado, they're thinking about using existing EMTs or existing mental health clinicians to be the responders on that van. But there needs to be a reckoning with some of the systemic problems in those systems as well, and the affiliations with the systems of policing. Because after all, in Aurora in 2019, it was a paramedic on instruction from police who gave an overdose of ketamine to Elijah McClain and killed him as well. And in Denver, we have severe problems with mental health response, and the way that there are entrenched systemic racisms and biases within those systems as well. And so as we talk about those four pillars, or three pillars, but in this case, trying to create a fourth, we still need to really make sure that as we're creating them, that we are dismantling the racism, the systemic of violence that comes with some of the systems that exist already, and the way that we approach safety and crisis already. And that's a really long project, and it's one that's not going to happen overnight. But in Dasher's case, we're working to give somebody that other tool, but also working to create something of our own as a long-term project.
I don't want to add anything to what Ebony and Vinnie just said, because they're totally right in terms of like how people should be qualified to handle these situations. And what I do want to bring up, though, is what few people know is that police departments have like no transparency when it comes to their hiring practices, like none. There is very little accountability in terms of police hiring practices. And so the ones who are responding to your 911 phone calls are not always the best qualified to do so. And I often say this in terms of like, especially like warrior style policing and how we've trained police officers. When you train something to be a hammer, everything's a nail. You cannot train law enforcement to also respond to the long list of other things that they have been slated to respond to, especially when the hiring practices are not there. Again, like the best word to say is like, they're not transparent. They can decide not to push your application forward at any point, and they don't have to necessarily give you a reason. And so behind the scenes, they can be very picky and choosy, and no one is immune to prejudice or bias at all. And so you have law enforcement hiring law enforcement through a system and a process that very few people know about, are privy to, have insight to, and can actually hold accountable or be like transparent to everybody. And so that's the other issue of like the reality of what we're dealing with today versus like what we need to be moving towards when reimagining policing, because we are not vetting our law enforcement as we should be.
Yeah. And I think, that goes to why there is a need for, currently in the way that we have things structured, why there is such a critical need for CAHOOTS or Dasher style services, in that we don't seem to be having the folks who are very qualified in mental health services, in crisis intervention, in addressing homelessness, in the police kind of system. And so it doesn't make sense to have them fulfill those roles. I think it's very kind of conceptual for, I think, for many folks, what exactly this kind of, CAHOOTS and Dasher style program looks like in terms of like actually responding to a call. So I'm, in learning about this, in my constant learning and just trying to just get more and more information, so I can help, make the best society possible. That way, public safety, public health works for everyone the way it works for me. I want to help this, and so, in my head, I envision somebody needs help, so I'll call 911, because anytime I've needed 911, they've shown up, they've been helpful, they've addressed anything I needed, and then they carry on their way. And so when it works like that, when it works perfectly for someone like me, there's no need to change anything because it works, right? It works for me, and therefore it works for everybody. And we know that's not the case. And so, what does a call from somebody? They call Dasher, they call CAHOOTS. Can they call you directly? What does that look like? What does it look like if you respond versus if someone from the police department were to respond? Vinnie or Ebony or Carmen, do any of you want to jump in on that?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
I think the immediate thing that's different when we show up on a scene is that we are trained to identify what feels threatening to our client, what has you in this crisis state. And law enforcement is trained to identify who and what is a potential threat. And it makes sense to me why they're taught like that. And it makes sense to me why we are taught the way that we are. And we have two very different responsibilities. And mine is to help you feel more comfortable right at the outset. Because like I said, you can choose not to talk to us if you don't want to. So how can I immediately, just getting here, help you? What is your body language telling me? What are your words telling me? And what can I do with my body language and my words to match that where it is? In order to get a hold of us, for us to respond to you as CAHOOTS, one of the things that we have been hearing the most from our community members as feedback for us to have room to grow is that you should not have to call the police department to get a hold of us. And as we're currently set up, you do. You can either call the non-emergency police line or 911, and one of those two routes is going to get you through to the dispatchers, who will then make sure that the call is safe for us, and then we will go. And there are plenty of people in our community, especially marginalized populations, that are not comfortable calling for us because of that, because there is still this chance that you're going to get a law enforcement response instead of us. And when they answer the phone and say police, fire, and CAHOOTS, they hear that police piece and they just won't. And as far as I'm concerned, they have every right to feel that way. That trust hasn't been earned for them. And so the trust that we have built with the community is sacrificed in that pocket because we don't have a different way to be reached. And that is not something that I have been able to fix overnight. And I have been in this role for coming up on a year now. And it's something that I've been hearing from the community and I really want to figure out how to address. But all of our operations were set up around this premise that you were going to call in with an emergency and then we are going to show up. We don't have an avenue for another phone call to come in. And so how do we bring that in and make sure that those calls are going to play well together, that we're going to still be able to triage which one is most important and where we're going to go next? There's a lot of operational pieces that need to be figured out about how another way to get a hold of us is going to be effective. And it's something that had we consulted with BIPOC community members from the start, probably would have figured that out on the front end, and it probably would have been a lot easier, but we did not. And so we are now, and we're trying to figure out how to fix it. But I say that because anybody who's thinking about what this can look like in the future, what this might look like in their community, start by making sure that when you're looking at implementation or like concepts, you have a diverse group of voices that are contributing to what public safety is going to mean to them. Because as long as it is a group of folks that look the same and have the same lived experience, you're going to get the same results, and it's not going to be inclusive to everybody. And that is not true public safety. Public safety means everybody. Public health means everybody. And you don't have to earn it. It's not something that you have to have enough value to get access to. You just get it because you're a person. So when we show up, there's all of those pieces. And then we show up on scene, right? And we're just going to talk you through it. We're going to figure it out. And if you're escalated, scared of something, being reactive to something, we're going to try to figure out what it is. Can we separate you from it? Is it internal? How can we get from where we are to somewhere where we can problem solve? And what is that result going to look like? People choose to come with us, right? If we want to take you to the hospital to keep you safe, or we want to take you to the 24/7 walk-in crisis center to keep you safe, if we want to take you somewhere, you have to agree to go. We can't force you to go with us. So we've got to figure out what also feels right for the client. And we can explain why the hospital seems like the best bet, right? It is cold and not the friendliest, and it's very clinical and kind of sucks. But it is a place where you're going to make it through tonight to figure out what you want tomorrow to look like. And that's important to me. Do you have a better idea? And you let them come up with what is their better idea. Do they have a friend that they forgot about, but that they do trust that can come over and spend the night with them, right? Because I'm down for that. I just can't leave you here alone. And I'm not going to do that. So what else can we come up with that is not you sitting here by yourself, feeling hopeless, thinking the dark thoughts that make you feel scared? What else can we do? I'm open to your ideas. I have my own ideas. I'll probably like yours better. I don't want to take you to the hospital any more than you want to go, but sometimes people are stuck. And so we don't just leave them there, and I'm not going to punish them for that. So that, to me, is really what it looks like when we show up on a scene. And not everybody is suicidal. Some people have basic needs that aren't getting met. Some people are just haven't taken their meds in a little while. Some people are really just something bad happened and they have no idea what to do. We'll go with officers to death notifications because we are trained in grief counseling and can be present for that. And sometimes we are sent to deliver the death notification because we have what it takes to catch you after that. And say, can we call somebody for you? Do you want our help calling somebody who lives in this area near you? Who could you call? What are your support systems? What is your religious background? Is there a system that you believe in that you can tap into in this really hard moment? Because when you get devastating news, you forget how to be a person. Like, that happens to all of us, right? Like, you're just like, well, now what? Right. And so having someone there who's trained to just accept whatever that response is, because it looks different for all of us, and just guide it in a direction that feels supported, that's really what we're showing up to do. Whether you're suicidal or suffering from grief or struggling with substance or housing and you find yourself on the streets and you don't know what to do, we're just there to help you figure out that there's some direction for hope. There's something we can figure out how to do. And we are going to sit with you in the rain or in the grief or in the trauma. And we're going to help you get to that thing. You don't have to do it by yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's spot on. I mean, it goes back to the point you had mentioned earlier about, humans helping humans. You're going to sit in that with each other. You're going to, sit next to each other and look at the problem together and see how we can, fix it. I have to imagine that, even I don't have to imagine. I know that if I'm sitting here and I've done nothing wrong, I'm just sitting here and I see a police officer come up and they're wearing, a bulletproof vest, I'm immediately on edge. So nothing I do is going to be something how I would react typically. And versus having somebody like Ebony, like Vinnie, like Carmen come up and chat with me and say, what's going on right now? Tell me how we can work through this. And I love that. Not humility in a condescending way, but in that true sense of, I have ideas on what could be helpful. I don't have the best idea. I mean, I have really good ideas, but this is what's worked for other people I've worked with. What is going to work for you? And I love that approach. It's really, really disarming, and it feels really empowering. Just hearing that from sitting here in the safety of my house, of like, I could very easily talk to Ebony or Vinnie or Carmen of if I needed something, because they want to help me figure this out. They're there with the sole purpose of helping me get out of this situation right now. And help me make tomorrow look different, or look the way that I want it to look. So I love everything you said about that, Ebony. Vinnie, is that similar to how Dasher works? Are folks able to call directly to Dasher? Do they have to call, do they have to call the police department first? Is your experience on these calls, are they similar to Ebony's with CAHOOTS, or do you have other thoughts that you want to share about that?
Yeah, first I want to make the distinction of like Dasher, the organization, and STAR, the program. So we don't receive 911 calls. Like we don't go out and start a van. We've been a community driver and the community facilitator of the STAR program since last year. But so how STAR works is people call 911. The dispatcher makes their own decision, in line with their decision tree, to send STAR out, to send a co-responder unit out because we have that as well, or send the traditional policing unit. In Dasher, we have our own kind of community response that isn't so much tied to the traditional public safety system, but we do have people that call us, and we do have our own kind of like group of street medics and volunteers that respond to situations. And the really, I guess it's kind of a strange thing right now is that STAR currently only serves a portion of Denver, and only during Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to or 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., which actually was a weird decision that the community didn't quite get to make. Because we feel like that could have been a thing that existed on the weekends as well. But, so because of that, when people call 911 and it's outside of service hours or outside of the service area, then they'll get in contact with police. And so that's not what they called that number to get. And so sometimes it is the case that they'll call Dasher instead, which our number is on Facebook. And so people end up calling us as well. And, it's hard because we don't quite have the capacity right now to answer those calls. I don't know if we even have the right to, but we do try to respond to the extent that we can in the community. But one thing with STAR is we also have a number, 720-913-STAR, but that still goes through 911. It just flags it as a call that people want STAR instead of the traditional police model. But they haven't really advertised that number. So we've been, as a community, trying to go out and advertise that number and make sure people know about it so they can call it, so that we know how much people are using that number and are requesting STAR as opposed to just calling 911. But one thing I would say in Dasher's approach, in terms of STAR, I think I agree with Ebony that it's more of a treatment focused. What are the needs versus what are the threats? I think that's a great way to frame it. I think that's how STAR really does approach it versus traditional police, and I would even say co-responder. But for Dasher, I would say we're positioned in a little bit different way, because I think we're on the other side of a lot of things when it comes to our traditional safety system. For example, last year we fostered a network of street medic stations and safe houses and supply stations to support the protesters in the midst of police violence during the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests in Denver, whereas the police were on the other side, obviously committing that violence. And so, we are more of a community-rooted organism, I would say, that is still building, still growing, and hoping to be more able to respond to things. But more importantly, we want to equip our own community to be able to answer distinct situations that may not even need a call to 911, whether somebody can use immediate first aid, like a street medic training would provide, or mental health first aid, or restorative practices training, or an overdose response training. Those are all things that we would love to see our entire community equipped with. And that's something that's, again, a much more long-term vision for Dasher.
I really enjoy hearing about these programs, and we don't have exactly like Dasher or CAHOOTS in Seattle or Washington. We do have, like, the Seattle Police Department has a crisis response team, and the King County has a mobile crisis team, and I think it's the King County Crisis Connections line and designated crisis response team as well. And the problem with all of this is you still have to work with law enforcement. You still have to deal with police. And that's kind of the problem, right? Is not everyone wants to work with police. And something that came to mind when Ebony was speaking was this phrase I've heard, and I don't know who said it originally, so if anyone does, please correct me, but it is a privilege to believe the police will protect you. I'll say it again. It is a privilege to believe the police will protect you. Because a lot of times when we have to deal with law enforcement or police officers, it is a more like reactive, shoot first, ask questions later type of situation, unfortunately. And if you're going through a mental health crisis or a substance abuse crisis, or you're dealing with your demons, even our crisis response teams in this area still are through law enforcement. And right now what's like getting attention is my King County representative, Reagan Dunn, proposed giving more money to King County Sheriff's Office to fund a hate crime unit, which is so problematic because their response to the increase in hate crimes and hate speech is to give more money and to fund like another unit that we don't need. The whole point of this conversation, what we're talking about, is reimagining public safety outside of law enforcement, because as this has been talked about by both Ebony and Vinnie, is that not everyone is comfortable or safe working with law enforcement and police officers. So we need to have alternative methods, reimagined methods that are outside policing, that are outside law enforcement, that where we are approaching the situation as it should be approached, through more compassion, through social services, through a social worker lens. And the number of times I've taught criminal justice classes and my students have been like, well, why don't we just hire more social workers to be police officers? That's not how it works. And they're not going to change it to hire more police officers or more social workers to be police officers, because they're two completely separate entities and they have two different jobs, because the purpose of our criminal justice system is crime and punishment and law enforcement. It's crime, it's punishment, it's law enforcement. The idea that our criminal justice system is supposed to restore and rehabilitate is still a very newly practiced idea and concept that we are still trying to figure out. And have not been successful in completing 100%, obviously. So I think, as has been talked about, like we need to give autonomy and power and funding and investment to these services and let them handle it outside of law enforcement and let them become one of those tiers of first responders, because we do need mental health and stuff, and mental health like first responders outside of law enforcement. So I really commend like everything that Dasher and CAHOOTS are doing. And I hope that we can continue to evolve it.
Yeah, that was a perfect segue into kind of looping back for both what Ebony, Vinnie, and you said about funding these services. And I mean, that's always a question of, yeah, these sound great, but like, how are we going to do it? We don't have the money to do it. So I'm just going to leave that nugget there. Do we have the funds to do it? How would we ever come up with the funds to do this? Vinnie, you have a big cheesy grin on. I really lined that up as a softball pitch for you. So do you want to take that on, my friend?
Yeah, I'd imagine there's a phrase we could probably use, but I think it's not a new concept, and it's one at least that's been around in Denver for a while, in the form of something called justice reinvestment, and taking money from the criminal justice system or the public safety systems to fund things like treatment programs or crisis response programs, or I would argue in other cases, housing and other types of programs. Like I mentioned earlier, Denver's housing budget is less than 1% of our municipal budget, which is really stark contrast from the 1/3 of our budget that we spend on public safety. But that's where the money is, in my opinion, and I think that's where it should be targeted, is public safety budgets, which take anywhere from 30 to, I think, close to 50% of municipal budgets across the country. I know that we're working with several cities right now that do 40% of their budget is public safety. And in Denver or Colorado this last year, there was a bill that was introduced in our state capitol that was intended to fund programs like STAR and others that we've been working with across the state in terms of community responder programs. But they lumped it in with a bill that funded peace officer mental health services. And so it felt really weird to lump those things together, that we're going to fund mental health services for police officers and also divide that funding to community responder programs like CAHOOTS or STAR and co-responder programs as well. And in that legislation, it earmarked that $2 million was to be set aside for the peace officer mental health piece of it, which would have effectively eliminated all other funds for the co-responder community responder programs. So it was very weird because it put restrictions on how the state funds those programs, while also actually not giving any money to it. At the same time, the programs that would apply for that funding had to go through police departments to get it. And so that was also something that we opposed. And eventually there are amendments that were passed that eventually said that, it doesn't have to go to police departments, it could go to public health agencies or behavioral health organizations, but they still have to get permission from police. And so in Colorado, our suspicion was that police would always choose a co-responder program over a community responder program if given the option in Colorado, which meant that we weren't supporting these programs whatsoever. But in terms of getting money out of public safety or the criminal justice system, I want to offer something that Colorado did a few years ago in 2017 called the Transforming Safety Grant, which took $3.2 million out of Department of Corrections and gave it to North Aurora, which is one of the most critical need areas of Colorado, and Colorado Springs. And that money was dedicated towards food insecurity programs, education programs, crisis response programs, and other community building programs. But it took it directly from the criminal justice system. And it was found to be so successful that in 2019, they reapproved that program to extend even further than its initial allowance. And so that's been around for several years. And it's an idea that I think falls in line with what we're getting towards, which is that idea of defunding the police, which really, like many people have said, isn't so much, in my mind, a declaration, although it is, it's more of a policy position and how we put our own morals and our own values and our own critical thinking behind how we really empower communities and how we keep them safe. So to answer your question, do we have the money? Yes, absolutely. Can we get it to places that need it? That's a much different argument that is going to be a longer fight and one that we're going to find a lot of resistance to because it's such a sensitive thing for legislators, police departments, cities, but it's necessary and it's urgent and it needed to happen yesterday.
Yes, to all of those points from Vinnie. And really can notice that for the CAHOOTS program specifically, we have been underfunded for many years. We have operated at a $500,000 deficit for at least the last 4 years. And we're part of a larger agency who helps cover some of that. And with donations from the community or other sources of grants, and CAHOOTS is funded through contracts with both of the cities that were in both of those police departments and some money from the county. And just recently, a little bit of wraparound funding from one of our local healthcare organizations, because they're noticing that we are diverting some of that cost by routing people to appropriate services in those moments rather than taking everyone to the emergency room. And so there's various components and ways that we save funding. We asked the Eugene Police Department how much perhaps we save them, because we know we take 17,700 incoming calls. That's how many we took in 2019. And that's about 17% of the calls that came in for service. EPD did their own analysis, the Eugene Police Department, and found that they think about 5 to 8% of the calls are actual diversions that they would have showed up to if we didn't go. And when you look at that and how many officers they would have had to pay to respond to that many calls, we've saved them more than $2 million in police officer wages alone, before you look at jail diversion or hospital diversion or any of the other resources that we are either appropriately using or relieving from the community. So we've saved millions already. And then when you subtract our $900,000 operating budget with the city of Eugene, we've saved a net of $1.2 million. And I don't know where it went. So recently, in the last few months, I kind of asked for it back. And I thought, if we've saved it and we're underfunded, I'm just a little curious if we could get it. It's not that easy, turns out, but the point stands. And the reason that we're now asking for more funding, like right now, is because I'm learning that Portland is starting their own street response, or other areas have their own, right? And they're getting asked, why aren't you as cheap as CAHOOTS? Well, CAHOOTS staff don't make enough hourly to pay their bills. And we've been underfunded for a very long time. But because we're grateful to be providing this service to the community and we don't want to rock that boat too much, and we know our funders are the police, where this money would likely come from, it's a delicate line to stand on. But at this point, we have an ethical obligation to say funding is crucial. Funding is such an important component of this service, because that is where part of being in the public safety pocket and having contracts through the police department, one of the benefits of that is that it's the most secure funding. When budget cuts come, that's a pocket that they're not going to come for as much as they're going to come for mental health, because we've deemed it so important. And whether or not I think that that's how we should do it, that's what it is. And so there's some pieces of this funding that makes sense, but I think there's a lot of ways that we could and should look at it. And so there are cost-saving components, but again, mobile crisis should not be run as cheaply as possible. It should be run as well as possible. And funding is so key.
I love everything that y'all are saying, and I hope that we can hang out in the future because there is absolutely enough funding for this, and we need to really take a critical look at our county and city budgets, because those budgets are moral documents that are public record for anybody to look at. But just for people to understand, in the city of Seattle, SPD's budget last year was almost 4 times that of their education and early learning budget and 1.7 times that of their human services department budget for all of human services for all of Seattle. So it's this disproportionality of funding that we are talking about when we talk about reallocating funds from a grossly over budgeted law enforcement side of things to community and community resources and human services, social services, things that are going to be long-term investments that are going to have long-term results, because policing and funding policing as heavily as we do. And mind you, we fund policing like we fund our military budget. We fund our military more than almost like any other country in this world, right? And we do the same thing with law enforcement and policing. And one of the reasons I even decided to run for Renton City Council was because in this most recent budget that got passed in just February, they gave $43 million to Renton Police Department, but $1.5 million to Human Services and less than $6.5 to neighborhoods and recreations. And so we have the funds, and we need to reallocate it because we grossly overfund policing. I love what Colorado did that Vinnie mentioned about reallocating funds. My only caveat is like corrections already gets the lowest amount of funding of all 3 criminal justice branches. And so I would really love to see that money come directly from law enforcement as well as like the rest of the criminal justice system. But just because of my bias of working in corrections and particularly juvenile corrections, we get the least amount of funding, and we're the ones that are actually trying to work with these individuals on a very, very like shoestring budget, where law enforcement, at least in Seattle, an entry-level law enforcement police officer for Seattle PD starts at over about $32 an hour. That's entry level. So we need to look and hold them accountable to their budgets, as particularly like we need to stop letting law enforcement pay for settlements of misconduct and use of force through their budgets. We need to cap overtime for police officers, and we need to hold them to more stringently to make sure they are spending their money appropriately, rather than maybe covering their behinds on mistakes that they've made.
Yep. All of this. This has been it's just so enjoyable listening to folks who are so passionate, not about like trying to take money away from or jobs away from the police department, but supporting folks who are well-trained, well-equipped to support our community. And I love that. And I'm going to steal Vinnie's thunder here because we're getting short on time, but he said something the other day, and I think it gets to the absolute crux of this, which, I mean, as you're all saying, we have the resources to do this. And, the question is it, or do we have like the moral desire? Is it something that we care enough about to do? And the way Vinnie mentioned it the other day is that policing is neither eternal nor inevitable. And we have the chance to do things about it. And Ebony and I were chatting about this the other day also of this idea that this concept is so hard of, to change what's always been or what we think has always been. And that's something that, in the queer community is so, we're so aware of that. Being in the community, we're very marginalized to begin with. And so we know that, growing up when we're young, the world doesn't look like what we need it to look like so we can fit into it. So we have to live our lives so that we do fit into it. And, with my experience as a trans man, I grew up and I was told that this is the way that the world is, and that's not the case. I had to make it so that way it fit me. And this is something that we totally can do. We have the funds. We have people who are compassionate and just incredible in their roles. And we can do this. We just have to decide that it's something that's important enough to do. And so I can't thank the 3 of you enough for being here and sharing your just incredible thoughts. This is not the last time we're going to be chatting, so keep your phones on. I'm going to be calling you very shortly. So thank you all. Thank you everybody for listening and joining in. Enjoy the rest of Pride, and we will see you all again soon. Thanks everybody.